All right, welcome everybody to this important event. I'm Mike Lake. I am I guess I would be the emergency host of today's meeting. I found out half an hour ago that I was chairing and got asked to chair, and it's an honor to have the opportunity to do that. I am a member of Parliament, a 15-year member of Parliament from Edmonton, Alberta, in Canada, and but this is my third meeting as part of the network here, and I found the first two absolutely fantastic. And this one is something that really speaks to my heart. I'm a parent of a 25-year-old son with autism, and I'll introduce you to Jaden through a video in a couple of minutes. But first, just a couple of housekeeping things. If you want, it's always helpful when people take part in the chat and introduce themselves, particularly with your name and where you're from and what titles used there, and maybe some contact information, because it's nice if we can reach out to each other afterwards. So if you can do that in the chat, that would be fantastic. There is translation, a French translation, French interpretation. At the bottom of the screen, there's an interpretation button, and you can find your translation there. And the other thing that I was going to say was, Joseph's going to remind me what the third thing I was going to say is. Maybe not.
It's about interpretation, introducing people. Oh, and the session will be recorded and shared after.
Session's recorded. That's right. That's right. So my stumbling over the beginning will certainly, I'm sure, be edited out, but probably not. Anyway, it's great to be here. I thought, before I get to introducing our two distinguished guests who I had a chance to chat with a little bit at the beginning, thought I would show a video here that highlights why this is so important for me. So I've been fortunate. I have a 25-year-old and a 21-year-old, and my 25-year-old son has autism and was included in a regular classroom throughout his entire schooling. And so the little video that I'm going to show here is a video of him in school, in his high school, his last year of high school, working in the school library. And one of the reasons that it's so important is because when we think of people with disabilities, developmental disabilities or other disabilities, it's so important for us to think of the skills and abilities and potential of people. So often we're focused only on the challenges, but Jaden's only able to do what you're going to see in this video because of people who were dedicated to unlocking his potential. And so just going to do a couple of things here to share my screen, and we'll go from there.
Now, that stigma often follows children into adulthood, holding them back from their full potential. But the tide may be turning. Tonight, we have the story of one young man who shows what can be achieved if given a chance. Here's CTV's Alberta Bureau Chief, Janet Dirks.
When it comes to putting away library books, Jaden Lake leaves others in the dust.
Jaden, can you do these ones too?
He's not just fast, he's accurate.
He's better than us at most of these tasks. He just knows exactly where everything goes and how to do it.
Jaden has autism. He was diagnosed when he was 2. Now 19, he volunteers at this school library in Edmonton. While he's nonverbal, he's an enthusiastic worker.
Do you like working in the library, Jaden?
Jaden also catalogs and labels and works with computers.
He could work in an office or a bank or anywhere where there is numbers and organization.
He's excited to work. He's excited to keep working.
Jaden's father is Edmonton MP Mike Lake. He wants employers to give adults with autism a chance.
He wouldn't be able to do a job interview. That would be a challenge for him. So if he wanted to work in a library or a warehouse or somewhere where he would be able to use these skills, he would need somebody to help him. He would need somebody to communicate for him and explain what it is that he's good at.
Research shows adults with autism spectrum disorder are underemployed. An Ontario study revealed only 13% work full-time. Just 6% have part-time jobs. In Calgary, Garth Johnson wants to change that. His company connects businesses with adults with autism in software and website testing.
Dedication, commitment, focus. They will do this job again and again and again for a long time, a lot longer than we would do jobs, and still love it.
Advocates for people with autism say it's not about charity, it's about creating opportunities, and workplaces stand to benefit most of all. Janet Dirks, CTV News, Calgary.
So that gives you an idea of why the topic that we're going to hear is so close to my heart personally. And so excited to kind of get right at it here. First off, I'm going to introduce Manos Antoninis, who joined the Global Education Monitoring Report in August 2011 from Oxford Policy Management, a development policy consultancy. He's worked as a monitoring and evaluation expert in education sector projects, including a public expenditure tracking and service delivery survey of secondary education provision in Bangladesh, the evaluation of a basic education project in the Western provinces of China, the midterm evaluation of the Education for All Fast Track initiative, the annual reporting of progress in the implementation of the second primary education development bank in Bangladesh, a basic education capacity building program in 6 states in Nigeria, and the evaluation of an in-service cluster-based teacher training program in Pakistan, as well as the country study of the out-of-school children global initiative in Indonesia. That's pretty amazing, Manos. Very, very distinguished, and it's a pleasure to have you here today to speak to all of us.
Thank you, Mike. That was a long introduction, but hopefully it could link the different parts of the world that should be part of this network one day. And I'm very, very happy and pleased at this invitation. As I will explain in the middle at the Global Education Monitoring Report, we're really very, very keen to see parliamentarians working together around the world to help solve problems, not only in their countries, but also beyond. I'm going to share also my screen now and take you through a few key findings of the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report, which focus on inclusion. And just to put you a little bit in context, what this report is, we are an editorially independent report hosted and published by UNESCO since 2002. But in 2015, we received for the first time, because originally it was more of a kind of pilot initiative, it was a successful experiment. And in 2015, we received the world's government's mandate to monitor the progress on education in the Global Development Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, with an emphasis on SDG 4, which is the global goal on education, and also to monitor the implementation of the strategies that will help hold all partners to account for the commitment they made to achieve SDG 4 by 2030. And I've copied a few images from our publications, the reports we've published since 2016 under the new series. The first one was on the relationship between education and the other development goals in 2016. In 2017-18, we had the report on accountability in education. And in that, actually, we did look at the issue of parliamentary committees. And we found actually that not much was written about the activities of parliamentary committees. And this is something that makes me particularly happy that this initiative has been set up, because really there's a lot to learn from talking to each other, and a lot to actually learn from inviting researchers to look at the work of committees. Our last report in 2019 was on migration and displacement. But the theme that I'm going to talk to you about is the report we published this June on inclusion and education, and I will explain how we approach inclusion. Just to let you know that every report is accompanied by, apart from the global report and the summary, which is available in almost 30 languages, we also have a youth edition, we have a gender edition that you see here on screen, and we also have started a series of regional editions. We published a report on Latin America and the Caribbean on the theme of inclusion, and another one is forthcoming early next year on Central and Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. So basically the former countries used to be known as transition countries. So a quick word of how we approached inclusion in education. The irony is that when the world's government committed to SDG 4, which calls on countries to ensure that we achieve inclusive education of good quality by 2030, still the definition of inclusive education had not been quite fixed in terms of everyone agreeing on what it means. We refer to the concept of inclusion as a process that embraces diversity, and builds a sense of belonging in order to achieve social cohesion. And actions that are geared in that direction need to be rooted in the belief that every person has value and potential, exactly what Mike was saying earlier. It's about not discriminating against anyone, not rejecting anyone. It's about how education systems can adapt to learners and their needs, not the other way around. Now, we know that the case for inclusion was made very strongly by the community that supported the rights of people with disabilities. It was them who ensured that the right to inclusive education was guaranteed in international law in 2006 with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 24. However, it took the international community another 10 years until in 2016, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities issued its General Comment 4, which had one fundamental, simple perhaps, but really very powerful statement to make, that inclusion is not just about one group. The mindset and the mechanisms that exclude and generate discrimination and rejection are the same for all those at risk of exclusion. So every society needs to own up to the mechanisms it has that exclude. Of course, we know that in the current context, things became even tougher. Ironically, the theme of inclusion was even more pertinent and relevant in the last few months under the pandemic, a period of very tough decisions that everyone has to take, a lot of dilemmas in everyday life. One of these dilemmas is about education and is about the forgotten idea, which comes from health, the principle of doing no harm, including also in education. Distance learning opportunities have actually expanded dramatically and showed a lot of promise, but we should not forget that they are imperfect substitutes for all sorts of reasons, and that ultimately it is the disadvantaged, those who may not be able to follow well from home, if they cannot concentrate in front of a computer for all sorts of reasons, if they don't have the home environment that enables them to do so, if they are poor and they don't have the facilities and the infrastructure to deal with distance learning. So for hundreds of millions of children around the world, education essentially has stopped for the last few months. And the pace of change, we should not forget, is also too abrupt for many teachers also and parents to respond to the challenge. Now, governments are confronted with a lot of difficult decisions on continuing keeping the schools closed or reopening, and under what processes, and how the reopening should be done in an equitable way. And there are, of course, a lot of challenges of coordination, of management, and of innovation. I'm going to also remind you that this crisis also showed that it's not only the academic achievements that should be looked after. It's also the social and emotional learning needs of children and young people, and their mental health needs. And of course, it's not just about the basics. A lot of other important aspects of schooling have been challenged. Subjects that are not so straightforward in terms of sequencing the process of learning from one step to the other. Also, those subjects that require physical contact or complex sequences. At the same time, there have been some promise and some opportunity to reconsider some aspects of schooling that have evaded so far scrutiny. How we assess students individually. A lot of the systems that we have in place currently exclude the assessment mechanisms that most education systems have in place, do not help children show what they have learned and how they have learned, but force them to show a relatively narrow range of learning that they have achieved. And also opportunities of reconsidering when schools should be open all year round. We have following a very traditional way of operating our education systems. Maybe even that could be put into question. And there have been also uncertainties over costs, depending on the length of closures and the effects that we may have over the next few months on our economic developments and economic growth. There are bound to be considerable effects. The report has estimated that the total cost of achieving SDG 4, the idea of achieving universal secondary education by 2030 in low and lower middle income countries, could actually increase by up to a third. However, at the same time, if governments decide at this stage to treat education as a sector that is under crisis and therefore needs to be protected, and if countries spend upfront for remediation classes and for the infrastructure investment that is required, the long-term effects on the learning losses that are occurring right now could be reduced by up to 2/3. I'm going to take you very briefly through the 10 recommendations that the report has on inclusion, and bring it and try to link it to the idea of this meeting, of this event, the links with COVID. And then Needy is going to actually make some of these observations and recommendations more specific to the case of students and learners with disabilities. So the first recommendation of the report, which is very key, is even though inclusion as a concept has been rooted for a long time to the case of learners with disabilities, because they were the furthest excluded, the furthest behind, it is very important to widen the understanding of inclusion so that our inclusive education policies are not just associated with one group, but with all those multiple learners with overlapping characteristics that are at risk of exclusion. And of course, there are new excluded students right now. You may have heard from different stories that there are those students who used to shine in the classroom together with everyone else, but now, as things stand, they are actually lagging behind, and there are others who shine and who benefit more from the opportunities that they have compared to the previous situation. Financing needs to be targeted to those left behind, and that is is a challenge that many systems are actually struggling to deal with to a large extent. We see cases where funding has been associated with need, with labeling, with particular categories, and that has led to increases of spending that many governments find difficult to deal with. It is very important to adjust learning financing mechanisms to support, to go to the supports that children need rather than the label that they carry. But it's true that as we return, many children that are more disadvantaged had less opportunity to learn, and therefore remediating their classes that focus on remediation will be really important. And that might also mean new teachers, teaching assistants who might help classroom teachers to deal with this particular pressure. Sharing expertise and resources is a very important recommendation, because there is a legacy in inclusion of actually focusing specialist resources in a few areas because systems were segregated. As we have moved gradually towards more inclusive systems where we ensure that every child goes to their local school, these specialist resources need to be equally spread so that they serve the needs of learners who have particular learning difficulties. So that is extremely important. At the end of the day, inclusion is first and foremost a management challenge in education systems. But also, this situation now creates new has created new challenges where a lot of students have resources to follow learning from distance, but others do not. And how governments coordinate and manage the process of procuring that equipment for everyone to be able to benefit is another new management challenge that they're facing. Engagement in meaningful consultation is another key recommendation. Really, it's all about partnerships if we are to achieve inclusion. The report is full of examples where governments should be listening to parents who have grievances, who have complaints to make about how education systems address the needs of their children. So it's very important to listen to parents and to school boards and listen also to their needs during this particular crisis. Governments need to continue collaborating with their peers. Not education ministries should not be only talking to themselves. They should be talking to their peers in ministries of health and social protection. They need to talk to local governments. As we know, it is a crisis that has affected the school as an institution, which means not only learning, but also a number of supports, social support mechanisms that many children, particularly children with disability, needed. And that has challenged governments to respond. Non-government actors are very important. They have been challenging the different mechanisms of government provision. We know that all around the world they play this twin role. NGOs have been watchdogs, holding governments to account, and also they have been providing services, many of which right now have also struggled during this pandemic. It is very important for governments to be responsive to issues that NGOs raise and to make sure that they continue to support the mechanism under strain. Universal design is the principle that has, let's say, shaped our understanding of inclusion in recent years. And it refers not only to infrastructure, making our schools accessible. It refers not only to all those building characteristics that should be respected, but also the learning environments and the learning materials and how they should be accessible. We know that online approaches are not suited for all, and ensuring that flexibility so that learning materials are also available in forms that allow every student to learn from a distance has been a big challenge. It's of course a challenge that is impossible to meet for some of the poorer countries in the world, but in those countries where intervention is possible, we should not forget that, because we know that many of these curricula have not been accessible in recent months. Teachers need to be prepared to teach all students. Inclusive education, as we know, is not a specialist topic, should not be a specialist topic, both at the pre-service and at the in-service training components. And the recent pandemic has also demonstrated that teachers can be powerful agents for change, not only in classrooms, but also outside classrooms. You have seen how important they have been in interacting with the challenges teachers faced in interacting more with homes and with parents who actually were not so ready. They had struggled to communicate. Just think of migrant communities that were really intimidated by the crisis and the need to follow the learning of their children at home in a language they were less able to follow and understand. Data is a perennial issue with inclusive education. We need to collect more data to identify those who are in need, but we also need to be mindful that labels should not be attached to learners, because they can very easily stigmatize. Very few countries have made the transition to something new, so a new mechanism. Portugal is one of those examples that we identify in the report that has actually abolished labeling and focuses exclusively on what support can be given to learners. And finally, learning from peers is very important, and that's what we try to do in the report. We have introduced a new website that complements the content of the report, which was exclusively in the past focusing on literature reviews of papers that have been written on the topic of the report, but we decided to systematically go through 160 countries in the world and how they have approached laws and policies in their education systems to achieve inclusion. So it's a resource that is available and to which we will be building with themes that are coming up, because we really want to support policy dialogue processes at the sub-regional and regional level. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Just to let you know that the forthcoming themes are non-state actors, so the role of private education. We will be adding, for example, on the peer information on how governments regulate private education around the world. And in 2023, we'll be able to come back and look at the crisis of COVID-19, thanks to the theme that had already been decided before the pandemic started, to be dedicated on the role of technology in education. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
And I think we'll do, thanks, Manos. I think we'll do questions after Needy speaks here. So Very, very enlightening presentation, though. That was fantastic. And now we're fortunate to be joined by Dr. Needy Singal, Professor of Disability and Inclusive Education at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Singal's research interests include the educational experiences of children and young persons with disabilities. She'll share her findings on the impact of the pandemic on learners with disabilities and the extent to which their needs have been addressed in the education response. So I'll give the floor to you, Needy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. It's a real honor to be here. And also, Mike, thank you so much for starting us off on such a personal and a positive note. I think enablers is something that we should definitely be focusing more on when we talk about persons with disabilities. So, and thank you, Manos, for really providing a very comprehensive overview of the equity challenges which are facing learners currently. But my focus, as Mike has said, would be specifically on learners with disabilities. Now, children with disabilities were less likely to be in school and learning even before the pandemic in many, many countries. And the situation has now been further aggravated. Findings from a very few recent surveys highlight the following concerns. So the first one, significant proportion of teachers feel unprepared and ill-equipped to respond to the learning needs of children with disabilities. Given the relationship between disability and poverty, these learners tend to be in households with very limited resources. Thus, things like online learning might remain inaccessible to them. In our debates, there is a considerable focus on loss of learning, which is important, but our concern should also be on the significant lack and loss of access to important rehabilitation services, which in many contexts are delivered in school settings. And also the impact of the prolonged school closures on children's mental health, something that Manos also mentioned. So in Ethiopia, a recent UNICEF report notes that over 40% of children with disabilities had heightened anxieties and stress, placing these children at even a greater risk. Finally, surveys also are beginning to tell us that when schools start reopening, there's some real concerns that children with disabilities will be least likely to return to school because of a whole range of reasons, especially in low and low middle income countries. So the perennial question is, what can be done? Given the short time I have here, I'm going to focus on just 3 points. And my first point is, let's adopt a twin track approach in all planning through the current, recovery, and the rebuilding phases. This means simply that mainstream education programs need to be designed for all learners, but at the same time, we need to develop targeted support to address the needs of children with disabilities so that they benefit equally. Few simple examples of adopting a twin track approach are deliver learning content in different modalities, such as ensuring when developing TV programs for everybody, there is sign language, closed captioning, etc. When planning back to school campaigns for all children, such as those being done currently in Ghana and Rwanda, again, put a special focus on the needs of children with disabilities, encouraging parents of children with disabilities to get these children back into school. As we build wash facilities in schools to address issues around safety, we need to ensure that these are accessible to children with disabilities from the very beginning. Rather importantly, we also need to recognize that disability is not a homogenized category, and we need to be mindful of different experiences within this group. For example, children with intellectual disabilities tend to be routinely overlooked in our efforts, while girls with disabilities might face significantly different challenges from boys with disabilities in many contexts. My second point of action would be view parents as partners. Parents have suddenly seen their roles completely changed, and we need to recognize this and help strengthen efforts to support them. In countries such as Mozambique and Rwanda, teachers have been providing parents advice on how to structure the day for the child, develop a growth mindset, and indeed encourage children through play, helping them develop other skills. And they've been doing so by sending out small video clips and radio announcements to parents. And in these settings, the role of community-based rehabilitation workers is also very crucial. Again, a point which Manos highlighted, this is where multi-sectoral approaches need to be brought to the forefront. Education sector working with healthcare professionals is a strong way forward. My third and final point is we need to urgently invest in better understanding the experiences of persons with disabilities during and post this pandemic. And this will ensure that we do not repeat our mistakes. It will strengthen our response efforts and, very importantly, put in place accountability mechanisms. Disaggregating disability data is important in highlighting exclusions and in supporting rebuilding efforts. And here, partnerships at the local level with disabled people's organizations become hugely central. So, just in conclusions, research evidence clearly highlights that education systems that are designed for the most marginalized children function for everyone. So let's not make disability an afterthought. What is required is a central commitment to ensuring equitable and inclusive approaches in a post-COVID context. And I'm going to stop here.
That's fantastic, Needy. As I was mentioning at the beginning, and we're going to take questions now from anybody that has questions. So please feel free, if you're familiar with the way to raise hands virtually, just at the bottom of your screen, there's a participants button. And if you hit it, it'll bring up a list of participants. And at the bottom of that screen, you can hit the raise hand button, which gives me a virtual hand up. Otherwise, just if you were to put your video on and wave at me, that group, small enough group that we can take some questions there. I see I've got some colleagues from Canada that are on the call. Holly, if you don't mind, I was mentioning earlier in the meantime, while we wait for to see if anybody has any questions, I was mentioning that there's this event going on Friday, this Friday, and it is the Global Disability Inclusive Education Forum, and it's being put on by Education Cannot Wait, Special Olympics. I think the UK government's involved. They have many partners, and Holly will she already has put a link in there for the registration page. So if people want to check it out, but it's so timely because that was the meeting that I had to leave to host this on short notice when I got the note from Oliver. And so great opportunity to kind of bridge the gap between both. I'm going to ask the first question because there aren't any hands up yet at this point in time. When you think about, so I talk a lot with Tim Shriver at Special Olympics, and he very passionate about this issue in regards specifically to disability. And you know, we brainstorm a little bit. We have backgrounds that give us a little bit of information for this. When we think about that last thing you said, Needy, the idea that if we reach people with disabilities, if we reach the very hardest people to reach, we're going to reach everybody else along the way, right? In a sense, if we develop our systems to do that, how can we engage students to help in that process, in a sense? I think in Jaden's situation, growing up, the kids he went to school with were a big part of his success. And I feel there's like a real power to you know, taking kids who in a school system generally are on the being helped side of the equation and empowering them to be helpers in terms of the hardest to reach and the most difficult circumstances.
I think, Mac, that's a really powerful reflection. So most of my work tends to be in the global south, so sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And within school settings, one of the most powerful way we see inclusion being successful in mainstream education systems is where we get to work with younger children and help them understand different notions of diversity. Okay, and I think it works both ways. So focusing on children with disabilities themselves to make sure that they feel equipped, that schooling is not just in terms of good learning outcomes, but the process of schooling itself is empowering. So focusing on issues such as the curriculum, making sure that you can have role models being depicted within textbooks, you have conversations in a classroom culture where teachers use disability in a more positive lens rather than regurgitating issues around stigma, etc., which might be in a community setting. And indeed, one of the big things that we're currently working on is really making a stronger case for teachers with disabilities to be part of the education workforce. So it's about making sure that children get to see positive role models which they can relate to. So that helps for children with disabilities, but also so-called non-disabled children, where they get to see diversity within adult life, within the education, professionals they meet on a day-to-day basis. So social emotional learning through peers and having a sense of belonging are all central part of making sure that children feel included. And absolutely, I can stress more on how important just get the school culture right, which is as a result of engaging with peers.
Manos, you talked about not having labels and the importance of sort of having that no labels approach. By the way, if anybody, I noticed Rochelle from Nita Vandenveld's office is in the chat. If anybody has a question in the chat, I'll watch that as well. But Manos, maybe talk about this idea of no labels and the importance of that.
So the report is quite strong on that. I mentioned that trade-off. Of course, you need to understand who is at risk of falling behind, who is at risk of being excluded from the education system. And inevitably, you need to have some way of understanding reality through some labels. But these labels need not be at the individual level. You need some questionnaire in your population census or in your household survey that captures the general characteristics of the population. And there you need to understand how well or how poorly some population groups are doing. But when you move down to the school and the individual level, the assignment of a label that may even be medically related is a major risk. It's a risk because, first of all, it alienates, stigmatizes a child. Secondly, it is a type of label that is not particularly meaningful because nobody only has one characteristic. We have multiple characteristics that overlap. And also the labels at the end of the day do not by any means tell you how what your potential is to learn. There's such a range within any individual group. So this is why I was referring to the example of Portugal as a country that has done away with the labels, a very progressive way of looking at the issue and focusing the financing support to the financing of schools to the supports that the school needs to provide to different groups of learners, regardless of what are their very specifically, sometimes medically diagnosed characteristics. So that's a major step in the process. I could also say that at the end of the day, anybody can be at risk of exclusion. Of course, there are some children that suffer most, and it's often quite clear where this happens. But anyone can. Anyone can find themselves in a situation where they feel alienated, and there's very interesting statistics, even at the cross-country level, that are compiled through learning assessments that show the sense of belonging of students varies between countries. And quite dramatically in some cases. We also see that, generally speaking, it's disadvantaged students who are more likely to feel they don't belong, which means we need to know a lot more about children. And at the end of the day, we cannot start breaking everyone into single small categories. Every child should be looked at as an individual. And I think some of the systems that have been trying to grasp with that and be more, let's say, show a more human face towards them, have actually started even monitoring how students feel at school, whether they develop positive relationships, whether they feel they're cared for. New Zealand is one of these examples that we mentioned in the report that I think deserves also some attention.
Now, it's obviously a quieter meeting today, and I think that's just the function of this time we're in. Everything is a little bit crazy, and there's a lot of pressing issues for parliamentarians. But I'm gonna continue. I'm just gonna treat it as I'm having a meeting with you and have the opportunity to tap into some of what you're working on. I'll keep watching for other folks that have questions. But on that front, so I think back to an interview my daughter did when she was 13. She was part of an interview with me and Jaden, with a guy named Steve Paikin here in Canada. And Steve asked her this question. Steve knew Jaden, and he said to her, Janae, I'm gonna ask you a really tough question. Do you ever sometimes wish your brother was quote unquote normal like every other kid? So she's 13, Jaden's 16 at this point. And she says, without skipping a beat, she says, honestly, since Jaden was diagnosed with autism before I was born, I don't exactly know what a normal brother is like. So Jaden kind of is my normal, having autism. And then he went on, he said, you like him just the way he is. And she said, if he didn't have autism or was like cured or something, he wouldn't be the same as Jaden is now. And, you know, we talk a lot about this idea that we're all, and I think this is to your point, Manos, we all have skills and abilities that we hope people will recognize in us, and we all have challenges that we want help with and that we need to mitigate. And Jaden's no different. His challenges might be different, and his skills and abilities might be different. And Needy, I like, you know, what you said about even people with disabilities. There's a range and completely their individual packages of skills and abilities, right? How important? Because you talked, Manos, about you know, making sure that we're finding them through census and things like that. Would you find that in some parts of the world, the kids won't show up in the census even because there's so much stigma attached that they're just invisible in that sense? And I think sometimes about this opportunity, maybe you can speak to it, and then Joseph has a question, but this opportunity with all of the money we put into community health workers who go into communities around the world in the most difficult circumstances, assessing the health of kids, if we just train them to recognize some of the developmental disabilities so they can be a part of a diagnosis and then eventually pointing in the direction of solutions. What do you think about that?
So on the issue of categorizations in surveys and censuses, this is a very sensitive topic and we can think of disability, which in itself raises its obvious questions, but this, of course, more general. When we talk about inclusion, the categories in censuses on ethnicity, on religion, on sexual orientation, have been very painful because for many people it raises fears of persecution, and you know, we don't need to go too far from Canada to know about how controversial questions about migration were in the United States in the last census. So yes, there are issues there. Countries are making small steps on progress. I don't know, one of the examples is indigenous populations in Latin America. In the surveys in the 1980s, hardly any country was including any question. These days, every country has a question on indigeneity, and countries start arguing how exactly should it be captured. Is it some characteristic of you know, how one feels, how one has been documented in official papers, what language one speaks? There are many different ways. So there are a lot of challenges. But in the case of disability, there has been a lot of confusion over the years in terms of how we define it. And the international community got together almost 20 years ago to start a process of how these questions should be asked, so that we get also a sense of comparability between countries. So the so-called short set of questions of the Washington Group, which was a UN statistical division put together to discuss this question, came up with these questions. They still have not received the support that, I mean, countries start gradually because censuses take place every 10 years. So it's only gradually they're waking up to the reality that they need to follow the same rules. But in the case of children, it's even more difficult because the way you identify, as you know, disability in a child is much more complicated. So the definition, the questions that are being asked to parents are a bit broader. They also capture outside physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, and intellectual disabilities, also other conditions that parents identify in their children, including anxiety and stress and depression. So that in itself has generated other issues when we come to understand how well children with disabilities are doing in education, because some of these characteristics of depression and anxiety, which are more common, are less correlated with poor education outcomes. They might or they might not be. So still, I think the international community is trying to find the way, but the reality is that it's the good news that it's all based on functions now. It's all based on perceptions of how one feels about their condition. It's not about a medical diagnosis. And so this idea that it's the society that is putting the obstacles to people, not the people themselves who have something deficient. So that's a major step forward that the world has achieved in a very short period of time if we go back the millennia of human history. So it's something we should celebrate and continue building upon.
Awesome. Joseph, you have a question?
Thanks, Mike. So I'm conscious that, well, we've very rich presentations from Needy and Manos with lots of suggestions and recommendations. I suppose in terms of our audience, and I would just say one of the things which we will do after this session is, in addition to making the recording available, we produce a briefing with suggestions, and then we'll be talking to our member MPs about, work streams. And there's a lot of interest actually in inclusive education amongst our membership. So there's also sort of, the opportunity to think about what it would be meaningful for MPs together globally to campaign on, to come together around. So I'd like sort of thoughts around that. Are there emerging ideas or moments that we need to get behind and have MPs take on? And then I suppose more generally, my question to you, Mike, as well, with lots of experience in this, but also Manos and Needy, is what would your recommendation be? I know there are no silver bullets, but is there something that you would say would be really important in making progress on this agenda, either at the national level for MPs like Mike who are operating in their own national legislatures, or across the globe where we're trying to use MPs' influence to act collectively on these issues? Thanks.
I don't know if Needy or Manos want to weigh in on that right now. I don't mind starting on that. I have thoughts, and it's very timely because this thing that we're working on for Friday is exactly specifically talking about that. And we've got the registration page there, but it's, I believe there's power in networks, right? I mean, this is when we're talking about tens of millions of people who are invisible to our school systems around the world, pre-COVID even, right? And especially pronounced during COVID. This is a problem we've got to tackle because it's a capacity issue in terms of our ability to do the things that we need to do. It's an equality issue. There are so many issues at play here. And, anytime you can tackle it through networks, Education Cannot Wait obviously does huge work in crisis context, but you've got the Global Partnership for Education, which is involved in this conversation. So along with Special Olympics and the International Disability Alliance and the Global Campaign. So you've got all of these organizations coming together on Friday. They've been meeting weekly to set up for this event on Friday. Short notice for anybody that's listening. But anytime we can come together, this will create some momentum, and it kind of builds on the Global Disability Summit from the UK a few years back. But I'll tell you what kind of drove a big part of this conversation was a individual conversation I had with Tim Shriver 3 months ago. And of course, Tim's mom founded Special Olympics. He's JFK's nephew. And we were both very frustrated at the lack of action. So getting to your point of your question, Joseph, and some colorful language was exchanged on this individual Zoom call. Holly was there with us, and it led to us saying we want to get beyond the endless meetings. We need to actually get to a place where we're seeing meaningful action on the ground. Now, this is a meeting coming up on Friday, but the goal here is to drive some meaningful action. And we've got partners. I don't know how many of you know Yasmin Sharif from Education Cannot Wait, but you want someone who's passionate and action oriented. She's absolutely fantastic. And there are a lot of others in the same boat. So I think coming together in networks so that we can, inform the policies in our own spheres, whether it's in our own countries or in our own circles, I think is magical when we can bring people together so that we can do things at scale. Because again, the problem's tens of millions of people. But Needy, you want to weigh in, Needy?
Yeah, I just want to build up on the point and add another one if I'm allowed to.
Awesome.
So I totally agree with partnerships. I think partnerships are so crucial. So actually on Friday, there's another side event as part of the UNCRPD conference going on, which is being hosted by the World Bank Inclusive Education Initiative. And actually one of the things we are discussing there is this notion of partnerships. So I totally agree with you, the need for making sure we have global actors, but just to emphasize the point, alongside local actors. So really getting in people within country context, also to advocate at the grassroots level, to really amplify their voices of what is it that they need to make it happen, what action will look like in their context becomes hugely important. So working with disabled people's organizations, etc., becomes really powerful. So you took a partnership. So in response to Joseph's question, I think my big thing is when I'm thinking about action and thinking about how policymakers react and what could be useful in conversations with them, is really emphasizing this notion of a twin track approach. Like, we need to focus on the all, and that's really important. Manos has really highlighted that. Intersecting variables, disability is not a homogenized terminology. It's a huge heterogeneous group of individuals with intersecting exclusionary variables of every kind possible. So, but taking a twin track approach, making policies for all, but taking into account individual needs, is so centrally important in financing, in physical design of space, in curriculum design, etc., and thinking it from the beginning rather than adding these groups as an add-on later on, which is really expensive and doesn't really help. So, when you think about inclusion, I love this notion of dilemmas of difference, which Martha Minow, she's a legal philosopher, talks about. And basically, she argues that sometimes when we identify difference, it's stigmatizing, but then if we don't identify difference, we'll never be able to respond to the need. And getting that balance right is so important.
And not be afraid to have conversations, right? So often in this social media world we're in, we're afraid to have conversations because you might get canceled if you say one thing wrong, right? We can't be afraid to have those.
I mean, it's true that in inclusion, it's, as I mentioned before, is a process, and there's no one way to get there. And that's why it is very important to speak to each other. I think my call would be for such a group that is, I think, so promising, is how to get your experiences in your legislature, your constituencies, to deal with these issues. What have you learned from the process of trying to convince your peers about taking some measures, so that they are aware, so that they can prepare strategies to convince others? I think in some parts of the world, there's still an awful lot left to be done in terms of attitudes. People still think it's normal to have someone educated separately. Of course, we know that in order for some children to continue being in the mainstream school, a lot of resources need to be allocated, handheld with teacher assistants, etc. But there are lessons to be learned about how every country got to where it was and how it can move forward. So I think it's very important to maybe share lessons from your experience in Parliament, in passing legislation. Who opposed it? Who supported it? Why? What can it be done to make things smoother? Because often there are some simple tricks that can win people over. I think that's what we try to focus in the report. We basically took maybe an extreme example to say, essentially, a discussion or anyone who might contest the very concept of inclusion in education is as if someone is taking a stance, I don't know, in favor of I don't know, apartheid, or some mechanism that excludes people and makes sure that they are somewhere separately. It's a painful discussion to have, and for many societies, it is a discussion that needs to be had. But the question is, how do you get there? Because still some issues continue to be taboos, and I think your experience in a parliament, in an assembly, is extremely important to be shared.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we're wrapping up. I will just sort of in comment to that. I think there's power to stories, and one of the things that we're trying to do is get people to share their stories. Jaden's story is such that we put him in a regular classroom because we thought it would be better for Jaden. But invariably, without exception, every one of the students that went to school with Jaden would say their life is better off because Jaden was in it, right, in the end. And that was not what we anticipated going in. And so, at scale, again, we're Needy, to your point, you want that local engagement. Everything has to be driven at that local level. But where that big network comes in is sort of rallying the best evidence from all around the world so that the tools are there for the individual organizations at country level to do what they need to do. And that's our job collectively. There's 12 of us on this call, and and thousands more like us out there. And collectively, we can do this if we work together. And this forum, the work that Joseph and Oliver and Zoe do to set up these meetings and everyone else coming in is so important to this. So I'll wrap up respecting time. I don't see any other questions here. Next week, there's a webinar. The webinar is on protecting and growing domestic and international financing for education. And we'll hear from some expert speakers, it looks like, on how COVID-19 has exacerbated the education financing gap and how we can still close that gap despite the pressure ministries of finance are facing. And so you get all the details. That is taking place on December 10th. And with that, we will wrap up this meeting, and thank you everybody, particularly Needy and Manos, for sharing your experience. Hugely valuable. Much appreciated.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike.
All right. Thank you.